According to reports, the average age of a Russian recruit in Ukraine has climbed to nearly 50. The reason won't really shock you at all. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so this is a not that shocking story from the Moscow Times, the only independent news outlet. I don't think they're even based in Russia. I think they just cover Russia. That Russia's army recruits are reportedly older and less capable than ever. Right, the Russian military is seeing an influx of older contract soldiers. Now, you guys might recall that the Russian military actually is made up of two classes of soldier. There's contract soldiers and these and conscripts. And the contract soldiers are soldiers who, well, sign a contract for a limited period of service. They're paid quite highly, and those are the ones who can be deployed outside the country to Ukraine. In contrast, right, conscripts are soldiers who are simply performing their legally required military years of service, and they cannot be deployed outside of Russia. So these contract soldiers are the source of combat power for Ukraine, for Russia in their war in Ukraine. But according to a investigative news outlet, anonymous military and parliament sources within Russia are saying that the average age of a volunteer fighter is now, volunteer fighters 45 and over are 50% of new recruits, according to a source in the Moscow mayor's office. The average age of recruits has risen from 40 at the start of the year, which is already troublingly old, to about 50 now, again, according to a Moscow mayor's office source. One Russian soldier fighting in Ukraine said that they're all sick. Their legs hurt, their heads hurt, they're slow. And this is, of course, a predictable outcome. We know that Russia has not only mobilized a large portion of its military-age men who already had completed some training, right, 2 years ago. Remember, those mobilized soldiers, they were mobilized indefinitely. So if they're still alive, those that are, they're still fighting. They're still under military orders. You also have these contract soldiers who generally don't live long enough to see the end of their contract, but only a handful do, and those that do, again, are generally brought back in one way or another, we'll say. But these high casualty rates mean that many of Russia's younger personnel, those that were ever going to enlist or contract, have done so and have become casualties and are now no longer able to contract. And so Russia's really starting to scrape the bottom of the proverbial barrel. It's hard to overstate the fact that while it's worth noting that Ukraine actually has a much older military, likely than Russia does, and that is... The difference, though, is that that is a function of the design of the Ukrainian conscription and mobilization system, right? Ukraine, from day one, before the invasion happened, said, listen, there was a weird population bomb, so to speak, that happened during the fall of the Soviet Union, where there was the time of great instability. There was a decade where almost no kids were born. And so that generation, who's now, again, at their peak military age, 20s to 30s, the Ukrainian government has said, listen, it's really important that we not, kill these guys off because they need to get married, have kids, and start careers, right? So that they can become the working age generation of the country. And a war doesn't really facilitate that. So they said, okay, we are going to skew all of our conscription older. We're going to start conscription at 27, now 25. We're going to give everybody a chance to start families, have kids, right? Produce the next generation. And then we're going to bring them into military service, right? So that's why you've seen Ukraine's military has been older from the jump. But Russia explicitly is like, we want kids. We want 18, 19, 20-year-olds. They recruit those folks for service. And they did. That's the thing. Russia did recruit those folks. And now they're gone. They're buried in a field in Bakhmut somewhere. And the result is that now they are seeing older and older and sicker Russians join up. This is a huge problem, okay? And we're going to talk in a minute about why. But before we do that, if you want to see what the fighting actually looks like on the ground, to do that, you've got to go over to combatvetnews.com. This is where I drop the videos that I can't put on YouTube, right? This is the combat GoPro footage, the drone footage. Excuse me. That's the footage that I can't show you. YouTube won't let me put on the platform. But it functions like a Substack or a Patreon. You got to become a member. So again, the membership, the nice thing is I run the site. There's no cut going to Patreon. There's no cut going to Substack. There's no cut going to Subscribestar. It supports me and the team directly, enabling me to continue to bring you guys the news of the conflict. Now, any one of these tiers gets you access to the twice weekly uncensored videos of combat. But if you want the lieutenant tier, right, that's got you some Q&A, and the colonel tier gets you by name shoutouts. So you can't lose. Go to combatvetnews.com, support me, and support the team. Okay. The why is not going to surprise you. According to The National, for example, who corroborated, who used sources from inside the British intelligence community, reported that in September of 2024, Russian forces in Ukraine averaged almost nearly 13,000 casualties a day. That's up something like 30% from the start of the year. And remember, casualties mean both killed and wounded, some of which may be returned to duty, but this is a tremendous, tremendous level of casualties they're sustaining. And that is a record high. And the reason is pretty apparent, right? You have a Ukrainian strategy that's pivoted to casualties first, right? That's why Ukraine is willing to yield places like Volodar or Pokrovsk or Avdiivka, because the Ukrainian strategy says, listen, there's no sacred ground, right? There's no ground that's so important that we incur massive losses to combat it, to hold it, right? And so but the Ukrainians have said, in exchange, we want to force the Russians to not sit in their trenches and absorb our assaults. We want the Russians to leave their trenches, to come out into these open fields, to cross open terrain where we are going to tear them to pieces. And that is what the Ukrainians have been doing, right? And here's the real takeaway from this, right? Is that the high casualties are part of what is sometimes called an operational death spiral, right? And what that means is, imagine, okay, you guys have maybe seen video of like the Ukrainian International Legion, right? Those are guys, they're between 22 and about 40. They're in awesome shape. They're highly trained. They're very experienced. And while they incur casualties, when you look at their operations, they're generally inflicting casualties at something in the magnitude of like a 10-to-1 ratio, right? Why? Because they're in shape, they're highly trained, they're highly capable, they're very motivated, okay? That's true of, I mean, look at any one of the Ukrainian influencers you follow, and you see that in those units, right? And, oh yeah, the longer they fight, the longer they stay at the front, they become more experienced, right? They become more capable. And so that means that the longer those units stay in place, the longer they fight, the longer they avoid becoming casualties, the better they are at their job. The opposite happens when you have a high casualty rate, like Russia currently has, right? And so one of the reasons these casualty rates are so high, obviously some of it is because of the fighting in Kharkiv, the fighting in Kursk, Russia's commitment to taking places like Pokrovsk at any cost, the Ukrainians are going to charge you, okay? But the other reason is because the average Russian fighting man is getting somewhat worse, right? Now, the Russians have improved their training pipeline, right? The units that the Ukrainians do confront, they say, appear better trained than they did 2.5 years ago when it was truly meat assaults. But these Russians are in bad shape. Their strategy still involves a lot of casualties. The Russians just aren't that motivated. They are increasingly relying on a strategy that involves attacking, getting torn apart, and continuing to flood troops into a combat zone until they make forward progress. And so while Russia's had some tactical advances, right, they are sending poorer quality soldiers with less motivation, with more injuries, with more illnesses. When you do that, right, you end up in a situation like what Russia's seeing, where you send, let's say, an infantry squad on an assault, and they take 80% casualties because they've never trained together. They're very old. They're sick. They're not very mobile. They're not able to quickly get to cover. They're not able to toss grenades. They're not able to do anything with alacrity. And so they take 80% casualties. The 20% come back, and they get the next generation of recruits to plus up their unit. So now you have 20% that weren't that great at baseline, and have a little bit of experience. But then you have this new generation of recruits who are even sicker, even older than the previous ones. So what happens when that unit goes on assault? Well, maybe they take 90% casualties because, again, they're slower, they're less experienced, they're less capable. So now you've wiped out basically all of those experienced soldiers, and you've wiped out all of these newer soldiers. So now you need even more recruits to fill up that unit. So you dig deeper into your barrel of your population. Now you have people who are not just old, but they have alcohol use disorder. They're addicted to opiates. They have tuberculosis or something. And they send them into combat, and they take 95% casualties. And now you have to scrape even deeper into your population to pull people out of prisons. You're pulling people out of drunks off the street, the homeless, severely mentally ill, right? What kind of casualties are they going to take, right? And so obviously that process isn't going to happen in 3 failed attacks or 300 or 3,000. That process is going to happen over the course of months and years. But with these numbers, this indicates these numbers of exceptionally high casualties, and this, an exceptionally older class of recruit joining up, it says that strategy is working, that the Russian military cannot sustain this offensive pace of operations with this level and quality of soldier forever. And that Ukraine, in contrast, who is focused primarily on preserving combat power, may actually find themselves coming out on top of these engagements more and more. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Thanks so much to our Colonel tier members, including James Sterling, Steve Moran, Doug Beck, Alan Knutson, Bastian Himmerling, Brian Kelly, Dale McCombs, James Ola, and Henry Roussier, among others. Thank you to all our Lieutenant tier members. You guys are the ones who make this whole thing possible. I hope you'll join us over on combatvetnews.com. See you in the next one. Cheers.